Hi guys, Jonathan here with Farmer's Friend. Today we're going to be showing you how to install this beautiful Haven high tunnel. This is the 2025 refresh of the high tunnel with the all metal baseboard kit, and we're going to go ahead and get started. This tunnel installation process is pretty simple, but we're going to go over some specific tools that you need to get the job done. First of all, you're going to need a couple of ladders that are at least 8 feet tall. You're going to need a level. We have a 4-foot level, shorter one you can get by with, a sledgehammer. You need an impact driver. It's at least ideal to have an impact driver. They work so much better for driving self-tapping screws. A regular drill. You need a few sockets, 9/16, a 1/2 inch, and a 14 millimeter. We have a 3/8 inch drill bit, some wire cutters, a couple of channel lock pliers, a utility knife, a Sharpie. We're going to be using this bandsaw for cutting our channel, the wire channel, but you can use also just a hacksaw or anything that you can cut through aluminum pretty easily with. You'll need a long tape measure that's long enough to go the length of your tunnel, and a second one that's long enough to go the width of your tunnel. And lastly, a pair of safety glasses to keep your eyes protected. When your tunnel arrives, it's important to check your pallet to make sure that there isn't any damage. And if there is, be sure to take some pictures so that we have record if we do have to do any warranty claims. But when you unpack it, you'll want to lay everything out and take an inventory and make sure you have everything that's supposed to be included in your order. So we're going to do an overview of what you should have when you purchase your Haven tunnel. You'll have your bundles of bows. For this tunnel, we have Gothic. If you order Classic, you will not have the Gothic section. We have our wind bracing and center purlin and roll bars. That's packaged together here. We have our ground posts, the crossbars, our single channel and spring wire, our double channel, the short sections, 4-foot sections of single channel, the batten strips, guide bars for your roll-up sides, your metal baseboard, greenhouse plastic. You'll have your kit box, which has all of your hardware and brackets, left and right gear crank for your roll-up sides, a box that includes your 4 quarter panel plastics, and a roll of rope. The first thing you need to do is identify the location that you're going to be building your tunnel. You want to have a flat location and as level as possible. So we would recommend that it's at least less than a 3% or less grade end to end or side to side. And if you have more than that, you may need to do some excavation to get your area nice and flat. So once you've identified the location and you know where your front end, back end, right and left side, you can look at the orientation. We have it in the manual, but we always try to work from, this end of the tunnel being the front, that end the back, and then left side, right side. So once you have that orientation, we're going to go ahead and start driving our ground posts. We're going to start with the 4 corner posts. And first you need to make a measurement and mark the ground post. So we're going to measure down from the top of the ground post 18 inches. So we're driving it into the ground till that mark reaches ground level. We're going to be using our jackhammer driver with the adapter that we sell. And that makes the whole process a lot easier, but if you can't justify renting a jackhammer or buying one, we also include in each Haven kit the manual driver. This just goes in the end of the post, and then you can use a sledgehammer to drive them. If you have like a battery or a gas-powered T-post driver, those can work as well for driving these posts in. So we're going to be using our jackhammer driver, and we also need to put the level on the post and, sort of the lengthwise and width. So we get this post nice and plumb as we drive it in. We can also, if you have one, you can use a post level, which can get both axes leveled at the same time, just making the process simpler. Now we need to measure down this side, the full length of the tunnel. And I'm going to be using a little clamp like this to secure the tape measure, save having to have somebody sit here and hold it. We are measuring from the outside to the outside. So on our corner post, we want that tape measure to be measuring to the front side of the post here. You'll mark 18 inches down from the top of the post and then position this ground post right on the inside of the length measurement for your tunnel. In this case, it's a 24-foot tunnel. We have a lot of different length variations of the Haven, so whatever length you purchase, that's where you'll measure to. And then we'll drive this post in and make sure we keep it level as we go. The next step is your right side corner posts, and this is where we need to square the tunnel. So you'll see we have the width measurement here. We're going 16 feet wide. That's the width of the Haven tunnel. And then in the instruction manual, there's a table that will give you your diagonal measurement for the length of tunnel that you are building. And again, our measurements are all going to be from the outside of the posts or outside of the tunnel to the outside. So 16 is on the outside edge of our post, and then we've measured out our diagonal. And once we put the ground post in a position where those measurements are intersecting, we'll drive it in, and again, making sure we get it level as we drive it. And we're driving it all the way to the 18-inch mark that we have here on the post. For the right side back corner posts, we're taking our tunnel length measurement and our width measurement and intersecting them to find that location for the last ground post, and we'll be driving it again down to the mark. The next step is to install the alignment strings, which is going to keep the rest of the ground posts in a nice straight line and also help us to know how deep to drive them. So we are going to start by measuring from the ground up the post about 9 inches. You can kind of fudge that number a little bit between 8 inches and 9 inches. The reason for this lower mark is for the baseboard. And so the height of the baseboard is right at 8 inches. So if you go at 8 inches, you won't have any gap underneath the baseboard. And if you have any high spots, you'll have to do a little bit of scraping the ground to get it nice and level. So if you don't mind potentially having a little bit of a gap, you can go a little bit higher. So that's just the reasoning for it. We're going to go ahead and just do it at 9 inches. Now we're also going to come to the top of the post, and we're going to measure down and mark at the 1 inch mark. So 1 inch down from the top of the post. Now, I will say with this mark here, depending on what type of driver you're using, for instance, if you're using a driver that is for T-posts that slides over the post a little ways, you'll probably have to do that string lower, or you may just have to rely on one string and just use a level to keep your posts going in straight. But for what we're doing, we're going to put it at 1 inch, and we're going to repeat this process on the other end of the tunnel. Now we're going to take a self-tapping screw and run it through the posts. We're going to do it just right below that mark so that the string can be running over the top of the screw and right on the mark. And you'll do the same at the bottom mark. Next, you'll take the alignment string and wrap it around the self-tapping screw and tighten this down. Now we'll run the string all the way down the length of the tunnel. Now we'll take the string and pull it nice and tight. We don't want it to sag. On a short little tunnel like this one, it's not going to sag much, but if you get to a longer 96 footer or 120 foot tunnel, those you'll definitely start to get some sagging in the string, so you want to pull it as tight as you can. And then we'll snug that down. Now we'll take the string and loop it around the bottom screw and snug it down. We want to try to get that string right on the mark. Now we'll run back down the tunnel and secure it on the front. Now that we have our alignment strings in place, we're ready to install the rest of the ground posts. Now you'll take your long tape measure and run it down the length of your tunnel, And before we start driving our posts in, we need to mark 1 inch down from the top of the ground posts. So we're going to be driving the ground posts in the ground until that mark reaches our top string. So we marked 1 inch at our corner posts, and now that'll keep the top of our posts all nice and level. Now we're ready to drive the ground posts into the ground. We're going to be placing them 4 foot on center. So you'll use your tape measure to find the center location. And then we're using our top and bottom alignment string to get them straight as far as the leaning in and out. So we don't want them to be touching the string. We just want them to be right inside the string. And before you start driving it, you want to get that perfect alignment to where they're just barely inside both the top and bottom string. And then we'll start driving this post. We do still need to pay attention to keeping it nice and level side to side, and front and back, you'll just use those alignment strings to make sure you're good. Now you'll finish driving the ground posts in 4 foot on center down this side of the tunnel, and you'll repeat the last 2 steps, alignment strings and ground posts on the other side of the tunnel. Now that we have all of the ground posts installed, we are going to just double check to make sure that we have 8 inches of clearance below the string down the length of the tunnel. Now, if you don't have 8 inches at, let's just say maybe there's a high spot, it's not a big deal. You can just take a shovel or something and skim that. But if you have too much of the area that is not 8 inches, you may want to, at this point, still adjust your string a little bit. And it's not too late to do that. You could raise it up a little bit to give you more clearance. Or if you have the majority of it where it's significantly above 8 inches, maybe you want to lower it down a little bit. But it's good to just go ahead and check. If you see any high spots, just make sure you know how much you would have to be shaving it down at this point if you don't adjust your string. We're looking pretty good. We have 8 inches of clearance all the way down. So the next thing before we remove the string is we just need to take our Sharpie and put a mark on the posts right at the height of that bottom string. So we're just going to go right behind the string, and we're going to mark on each ground post all the way down the length of the tunnel on both sides. Now we'll remove the self-tapping screws and the alignment strings. And you'll do this on both sides of your tunnel. The next step is to assemble the bows. We're doing a Gothic tunnel, so we have our Gothic center peak. If you're doing a classic, the way to distinguish the center section is that it's swaged on both ends, and then your side sections have a swage on the bottom side. So we're just gonna slide these joints together, and then we'll take our self-tapping screws, and we're doing 2 screws. We also wanna make sure that we kind of rotate the screw placement towards the bottom side of the tunnel so that there's no chance it starts interfering and rubbing on your plastic. So I'll rotate a little bit down to the side, and we'll do our first screw about 1/2 inch down from the joint. Now we'll place the second screw about 2 inches down from the joint. The overlap in the swage is 3 inches, so you just have to make sure that you don't go past the swage. Right. Now you'll do the same process on the other joint. Now we'll repeat that same process and finish assembling the rest of the bows. The next step is to install the crossbars, but before we do that, we want to make sure that the base width of the bow is at 16 feet. So we've got a couple of pieces of rebar that are kind of holding the bow at that 16-foot outside to outside measurement. And now that we have that in place, we're going to take our band clamps and slide them over the bow. And we're just going to slide these all the way up past the joint, rotate them, get them past your self-tapping screws, and we'll go ahead and install the crossbar to the first clamp here. The bolt will come through the bottom of the band clamp, and then through the hole in the crossbar and back through the top side. These can be a little bit tricky to get aligned, so you may have to wiggle it a little bit. And then you'll also want to index your carriage bolt to where the square head notches into the band clamp, and then we'll just finger tighten the nut. Now we'll go to the other side and get the band clamp installed. Now we're going to adjust this crossbar to where it's centered in the middle section of the bow here, and we're just going to reference off of our joint. So I need to slide it this way a little bit. If you have one person on either end, that will make it easier. Now I have the crossbar centered up in the peak section of the bow. It's just a little over an inch up from the joint on both sides. Once we have that nice and centered, we'll go ahead and tighten down the band clamps. Now you'll repeat the crossbar installation on the remainder of the bows except for two. Both of your end bows on the tunnel do not have the crossbar. The next step is to install our band clamps for the wind bracing. We're going to go ahead and slide them over the ground post before we install the bows to make it a little easier on ourselves. So we go one over the first ground post and then two over the second ground post. And if you run into a situation where it's too tight to get it over the bow, or over the ground post rather, you can take a couple pairs of pliers and just bend them out a little bit to slide it over, and one over the third ground post. And we'll do that on all four corners of the tunnel, working from the end in 1, 2, 1. Now it's time to install the bows. The first bow is not going to have a crossbar on the far end of the tunnel, and then the rest of the inner bows will have the crossbar, and then we'll end with our last bow, again not having a crossbar. The only thing we need to pay attention to with installing the bows on both ends of the tunnel is making sure that the self-tapping screws are facing the inside of the tunnel, so you may have to rotate it 180 degrees to get that alignment right. So now we're just going to install all the bows. Now that the bows are all installed, we're going to secure the bows to the ground posts, and while we're here, we're going to drill our weep holes at the base of the ground posts. You're going to have condensation and water that gets on the inside of the bow, and so we want to have a way for that to drain out. So what we're recommending is just taking your self-tapping screw and just come about an inch up from the ground and drill into the ground posts. We're not leaving the screw in there, we're just using this to drill that hole through the ground post. Now we'll do our first screw 1/2 inch down from the joint, and we definitely want to make sure that we're drilling on the inside of the tunnel so that we don't have screws damaging the plastic on the outside. Now we're doing a second screw about 2 inches down from the joint. And we'll repeat this process on the rest of the ground posts. Next, we're going to be installing the wind bracing. We're going to take our band clamp and we're going to get one of the galvanized bolts, and we'll run the bolt from the outside of the tunnel towards the inside. It needs to be in that orientation so the end of the bolt isn't interfering with the plastic and causing punctures. And now we're going to take one of the nuts and finger tighten it on the end of the bolt. Now we do need to make sure that before we tighten this up, we get our band clamp above the mark for the baseboard. So we're just going to go about 1/2 inch above that mark and tighten this down. Be sure to tighten down the band clamp with it lined up with the next ground post. Now we're going to go to the second bow and repeat that process with a slight variation. We're going to slide both of the band clamps up, and we're going to attach the wind brace to the lower of the two band clamps. Depending on how much you opened up these band clamps when you put them on, you may have to take some pliers and squeeze them back together in order to get the nut on the bolt. This one's a little too wide, so I'm going to squeeze that back together, and then we'll install our nut. Now the difference on this end is that we need to put a level on this bow and plumb it before we tighten down that band clamp. We want to make sure these bows are nice and straight. So we just rest the level up against the bow, and we're going to slide it back and forth, and then we'll tighten it down. This is also the reason why we're waiting to install the baseboard until a later step, because these adjustments require the ground post to shift back and forth slightly. Now we'll essentially repeat that same process with the second wind brace. We'll attach this end and go ahead and tighten it, and then attach the other end and plumb it before we tighten. Next, you'll repeat that process on the remaining 3 corners of your tunnel. Next, we're going to assemble the center purlin. We have one section of pipe that's non-swaged, and then the rest of our pipes have the swage joint. So we're going to slide them together, and then we're going to put a single self-tapping screw right in the middle of that joint. Now, as we go to the next joint, the only thing that we have to pay attention to here is making sure that we keep the screws on the same side of the pipe. So we want to make sure that it doesn't start rotating around on us. And this is so that all of the screws can be facing down and not puncturing the plastic. If you're doing a really long tunnel, or you're doing also a classic tunnel where you don't have crossbars to rest the purlin on, you may want to just assemble it in 3 pieces at a time, and then go and install those 3 sections, and then do the next 3 sections. Next, we're going to mark on the purlin pipe every 4 feet to help us space the bows when we're installing the pipe. And we want to make our marks on the same side of the purlin that we have our screw heads. So we'll just go down the length of it, marking every 4 feet. Lastly, we're going to take these finishing caps and tap them into the end of the purlin. And we'll do that on both ends. Next, we're going to be installing the purlin at the peak of the tunnel. With this being a Gothic tunnel, we have our crossbars that we can slide this up and rest it on. If you're doing a classic tunnel, you may want to be installing the purlin in shorter sections, 2 or 3 pipe sections at a time. But this will be pretty easy. We're just going to slide it up over the crossbars. We're going to be starting at the second bow in from the end. We lift the purlin up, and then we put the 2 halves of our cross connector over the bow and around the purlin. We're going to finger tighten the nuts onto the bolts. It's important to rotate the purlin to where the screw heads that we did all in a nice straight line are facing down. And then we just need to make sure that we're in the center of the peak, and that the black Sharpie mark on the purlin is lined up with the bow this way. And then we're going to go ahead and just snug this. We won't tighten it all the way down, but we're just going to snug it up. Now we're going to skip a couple of bows and do another cross connector down a little ways to start lifting that end. And then we'll come back and install all of the ones that we've skipped. And then we'll also do a tube strap on the last bow right here. The last step in installing our purlin is to put the tube straps at the end bow. So we're gonna, first of all, wear safety glasses. We're drilling up above our head, so we wanna keep the shavings out of our eyes. And we're gonna take the tube strap and place it over the purlin, and I'm just gonna hold it level there and then take my first self-tapping screw and go through the tube strap into the end of the purlin. All right, now that I have that in place, go ahead and get another screw, and then we'll have to pull on the bow to get it to line up with the end of the purlin. So once we have that lined up and flush with the edge of the bow, we'll put our other 2 screws to hold it into the bow. Now you'll repeat that process on the other end of the tunnel. The next step is to install the metal baseboard. Now before you do this, if you're installing a framed end wall package on your tunnel, now would be the time to do that, because you'll have band clamps and brackets that need to go on the end bow, and it's going to be much easier to do that now before you install the baseboard, and also before we start doing the single channel that will be securing our plastic. But for the sake of this installation video, we don't need to do that step, so we're going to move straight on to the baseboard installation. So we're going to start by just flushing up the baseboard with the end bow, and we want the top of the baseboard right at that mark that we made, which is 9 inches off of the ground. Again, if you want to get it closer to the ground, or you have maybe some low spots in the middle, you really want to start all the way at the ground on the ends, you can adjust that. But we're going to do it right at 9 inches. We're using self-tapping screws right through the flange on the baseboard and into the ground post. We'll be putting a self-tapping screw in the top and in the bottom flange, but before we do the bottom flange, we want to come down here to the second bow and make sure we get the baseboard right at the mark, and we'll go ahead and put the top screw in here as well. Now we'll come back and do the second screw on the bottom. Now we're going to install the second section of baseboard, and this is where we have our first joint. So it's going to be going from this joint, and we're always going to land on 2 ground posts. So you have to make sure that the baseboard is extending past that second ground post, and then we should end up with about 1.5 inches of overlap at the joint. So as long as you have a little bit of overlap here and it's past the second post, we can go ahead and make this attachment. So we're going to just hold the 2 sections of baseboard, this joint, together tightly. You can put a clamp on it if that makes it easier, but we just want to make sure that they're nested nicely together like that. And then we're going to take the self-drilling, self-tapping screw, and we're going to drill through both flanges of this board. And then once we get that hole, we're going to then at that point be putting the blunt tip self-threading screws into the hole so it doesn't stick out on the back side. So we pull that back out, and then we're going to run the blunt tip screw into that hole. Right. Now that we have that first screw in, we're going to come back down to this ground post, and we're going to lift up the baseboard to the mark. And before we put that screw in, I would recommend looking down here to the next ground post and seeing where you are in relation to the mark here. So if I put it right on that mark, it's going to put this one down quite a bit, it looks like, for some reason. It's going to be hard to get those marks just perfect, so as I would go to this post, I would say try to split the difference to keep it on a nice straight line. So we'll be slightly above the mark here and slightly below the mark here, and then we'll go ahead and put this in. Now that it's secured, we'll go ahead and put our second screw in the bottom flange here and also in the joint. Now we're just going to repeat this process down the length of the tunnel and repeat the last 2 baseboard steps on the other side as well. The last step on the baseboard is to install the end caps. This is just to seal off this area, and you're just going to tap this in until it's flush with the baseboard. If you have your end wall brackets on here, it will be pretty tight. You may have to tap it with a hammer to get it on. And then we're going to put 1 self-tapping screw right through the face of the baseboard into the end cap. Just like that. You'll do that on all 4 corners. The next step is to install the eye bolts through the baseboard for your anti-billow ropes on the roll-up side. And we need to make a mark. We're going to move in about 1.5 inches in from the ground posts. We're going to burn the first foot on our tape measure so we can get it flush up against the face here. And then we're going to mark 1.5 inches down from the top, from this bend on the face. Now that we have that marked, we're going to take our 3/8 drill bit and drill through the baseboard. And you'll take your eye bolt, and the first nut gets threaded all the way down to the base of the threads, and then we'll put a washer over. We'll slide the eye bolt through the hole we just drilled. Now we're going to put a washer and a nut on the back side of the eye bolt, and we will tighten this from the back. It's a 9/16 socket, and then you can use a pair of pliers to hold the eye bolt vertical on the front side, and we'll tighten it down. Now we're going to install an eye bolt every 12 feet, and you'll have to shift it to one side or the other of the ground post when you get to that 12-foot mark, and then the last eye bolt will go just to the inside on the other end of the tunnel. The next step is to install the single channel between the first and second bow for the bottom of our quarter panel, and then we'll be doing our vertical sections, which will be resting on top of the baseboard and then going up around the contour of the bow. So we're going to be starting down here, and then we're using our self-drilling, self-tapping screws to pre-drill a hole here. And then we'll pull it back out, and we're going to be using one of the blunt tip little stubby screws to attach it to the baseboard. We'll do 4 screws across the bottom, spaced about a foot apart. Now we're going to do our vertical pieces of single channel. One goes on the first bow, and then one goes on the second bow. And we're resting that right on the top side of the baseboard, and we'll be using our self-tapping screws to secure it into the bow. Now you'll repeat this process on the other 3 corners of the tunnel. The next step is to run an alignment string down the length of the tunnel and mark each bow where our double channel is going to be attached. So we've tied a loop in the end of the rope, and we're just going to loop that over our eye bolt, and then we run it up through the channel here and then over the top corner of the channel. You could put a little piece of tape or something there to protect it, but we're not going to be pulling this too tight. It's just sometimes that could cut the rope. Now we're going to pull the string snug so that it's not sagging at all, and then we'll get it right above these single channels for our quarter panel. And I'm going to just use a clamp on this end to temporarily hold this string. First of all, the double channel will just be resting on top of these 2 sections of single channel, and that should get you right at the perfect height. The rest of these bows, we're going to come here and mark on the bow right behind the string. And that'll be the location for the bottom side of our double channel. Now that we have those marked, we can go ahead and remove this string, and we'll repeat that process on the other side of the tunnel. Now we're going to install the double channel down the length of our tunnel. We're going to start by just resting it on top of these two vertical single channels, and we need to make it flush with the end of the bow. And then we're going to take a single self-tapping screw in the bottom channel and into the bow. And then we'll do a second screw in the upper channel into the bow. The next step is installing the tube straps on the back side of the channel. We have these short bolts that run down through the channel. So we're going to be taking one bolt and sliding it past this second bow. And then we've already taken the tube strap and we have one bolt and a nut. The nut is just barely threaded on, but we find that's easier. So we'll slide that on, and then it's loose enough still to be able to slide it over the bow. And then we need to push it over the bow and get it lined up with that bolt. So it can be a little fiddly, but once you get that through, then we'll take the second nut and thread it on the bolt. In this location, we just need to make sure that it's resting on this single channel, and we will go ahead and tighten it down at this point. Before you tighten it down all the way, you can just look at the face here and make sure that this bracket is not twisting the double channel, so it's kind of bowing it one way or the other. As long as that looks good, we'll tighten it all the way down, and then we'll put a single self-tapping screw through the tube strap into the bow. On the second channel, we have our splice plate. So we've taken the splice plate and threaded the bolts and nuts together through those holes. And then we just slide the heads of the bolts into the back side of the double channel. And we want to get this plate centered over that joint where the joint's going to be. And we'll go ahead and tighten down the first two bolts on the channel. Now we'll take our second channel and our second tube strap, and I have the bolts and nuts threaded through the tube strap. So we'll slide the tube strap over the bow. And at this point, it can be nice to have a second person helping, but we're gonna slide this over that splice plate and get that joint lined up. You also need to pay attention to the mark that we made on the bow and make sure that the double channel is right at that mark. And at this point, once we get this joint lined up, we're going to go ahead and tighten down these last two nuts. And we'll get this channel right at that mark. Once we're at the mark, we can tighten down these two. And we'll put our self-tapping screw through the tube strap into the bow. On this next section of double channel, we have a joint that lands on the bow, and it's a slightly different process for that. We don't use the splice plate because it would space us out too far. So we're taking another tube strap with the bolts and nuts already pre-installed, and I'm just gonna pry the channel forward a little bit and slide this back behind. And then once we get that around the bow, we'll take our next section of channel and we'll put the tube strap over the bow like we've done in a previous step and slide the channel over the heads of the bolts and all the way down over the bolt head on that channel, butted up against the previous channel. Now at that point, as long as we get our double channel on the mark, I'll go ahead and snug up this one. We may have to adjust that, but it'll hold it for now. And then we can come down here, make sure that our channel is at the mark. So I need to lift it up just a little bit. And then I'm going to push the bow over until we have that joint centered on the bow. And then we'll tighten down the bolts. Now you'll repeat that sequence of different processes for installing the double channel all the way down the length of your tunnel. And on the last bow, you'll just use 2 self-tapping screws through the face of the channel into the bow. And then you'll repeat the same process on the other side. The next step is to install our single channel over the end bows of the tunnel. We're going to start here right above the double channel, so we can just rest it on top of the double channel, and we want to center it up over the bow, and then we're using self-tapping screws to go through the center of the channel into the bow. You can use a squeeze clamp to hold this if you have trouble holding it and screwing at the same time. That can be helpful, or if you have a second person, they can help as well. What we're going to be doing is just bending it as we go and work our way over the bow, putting a screw every 16 inches or so. On this last part, we're going to start back just above the double channel, and we're going to attach it to the bow. Now that we've worked our way up to this joint, we can see where the joint needs to be cut. And you can use a lot of different tools for this. It's soft aluminum channel, but we're using a little battery operated bandsaw. Manual hacksaw would work fine. And we're just going to cut it right at that joint so that we can get that last screw in. Now you'll repeat this step on the other end of the tunnel. The next step is to install the quarter panels in this quarter quadrant of the tunnel on all 4 corners. So we're going to be taking this pre-cut section of plastic that comes with your kit, and we want to center it up in this opening. We have plenty of extra plastic for a good margin around the perimeter. And so once we get that centered up, we have some margin on both sides and on the top. We're going to start installing our spring wire across the top edge of the plastic. Now that we have our wire in across the top, we're going to start on the sides. And we got to get the wrinkles pulled out as we go. So I'm going to start working down both sides. And again, you just want to pull kind of diagonally to get all those wrinkles out as we work our way down. And we can kind of jump back and forth from one side to the other. Now that we get down to the bottom on both sides, we just have to work our way across the bottom. Last, we're going to just snip off the extra wire. That last little bit can be tricky to get in, so you can use a pair of pliers just to get that back in the channel. Now we're just going to trim off all of our excess plastic, and we'll leave just about an inch of margin around the perimeter of the quarter panel. Now that we have the quarter panel installed and the excess plastic trimmed, we'll repeat the same process on the other 3 corners of the tunnel. The next step is to install the plastics. We're going to start by opening up our plastic box and rolling it down the side of the tunnel. Next, we're going to cut the plastic, and I'd recommend leaving 2 to 3 feet extra beyond the last bow on either end of the tunnel, just to make it easy to pull it tight as you're securing the plastic. Next, we're going to be unfolding the plastic, and we're going to be making sure that we have it in the orientation to where the marking, which is on the plastic, there's a marking that goes roughly down the middle, and it says inside. The side that the printing is on needs to be facing down towards the inside of the tunnel. So once you've got that orientation right, we're just going to continue to unfurl the plastic and get ready to pull it over the tunnel. When it comes to pulling the plastic over the tunnel on a little short one like this, we'll be able to do it pretty easily, just one person on either end climbing over our ladders. But on longer tunnels, you may need to throw some rope over and then secure it to the plastic in a couple places down the length to help pull it over. And what we recommend is taking a tennis ball preferably, but if you don't have those, a rock can work. And you put it up behind the plastic right along the edge and kind of bunch it up around that rock or tennis ball, and then tie the rope around it. And that gives you a good secure point to pull the plastic over. And you have enough extra on the edges that that part will be cut off, so don't worry about puckering it up or damaging it. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and pull it over and move on to the next step. Once you get your plastic over the tunnel, you want to center it and get it in line. You can follow the creases in the plastic and try to get that center of the plastic lined up down your peak. And once we have that in place, we're starting to install the spring wire. And I like to start just to one side of the peak, kind of work our way over the peak and then down the end here. And as we do this, we're pulling on the excess plastic, and we're kind of pulling down diagonally to try to get all these wrinkles out. And as we hold some pressure, we're just going to be installing the spring wire all the way down the end bow. And we'll do this on both ends of the tunnel and both sides of the tunnel before we move on. We're going to run the spring wire all the way down to just above the double channel. And there's going to be probably a little bit that you have to cut off. So you'll use your wire cutters and snip that excess off. At this point, we're going to install the spring wire in the double channel, and we're going to be starting in the lower channel. As we work our way down, you may need to pull some creases out, but you don't want to pull down too hard on it because you'll start to shift the plastic over. So really, we're just going to pretty much just work our way straight down without worrying about pulling tension at all. And then when we go back and we put the second spring wire in the upper channel, that'll tighten up some of the wrinkles. We're going to work our way all the way down the tunnel on the bottom channel on both sides, and then we'll come back and do the upper channel on both sides of the tunnel. At this point, we're going to go ahead and trim off all the excess plastic. And so you can use a pair of scissors or a utility knife, and we're going to just leave a couple inches out beyond the bow. One thing to pay attention to is when you're trimming on the end here where your roll-up side is going to be, you want to make sure that you hold the plastic down and it's kind of resting in the position that the sides will be. Get all those creases out and then trim that edge. You don't want to end up with your plastic short here. You can always come back and trim a little bit more later, so if you're in doubt, leave a little extra. And now we'll just go all the way over the tunnel and do the same process on the other end. Next step is to set the roll bar over the plastic here, and it's going to be resting on top of the eye bolts. And at this point, we're not installing any self-tapping screws into the joints. We're just loosely connecting them and trying to get the whole thing resting up on the eye bolts. And we want to have 3 inches sticking out past the bow here. And we may have to adjust that after we get it assembled, but that's the goal, about 3 inches. The last section on the end opposite from where your crank is going to be, you're going to install this short 5-inch section over the end of the pipe. And now we have it resting on the eye bolts all the way down the length of the tunnel. Next, we're going to start installing the batten strips, and we want the end of the batten strip to line up with the end of the tunnel, and you're going to be starting with the 3-foot section of batten strip, and then the rest of them will be 6 foot, except for the very last section, which again is a 3-foot section. Before we start installing that, we need to make sure that our roll bar is not sticking out more than 3 inches from the end of the tunnel. Now you can see we have this bunched up plastic here. We want to get all that excess pulled under the roll bar, and we'll do that down the tunnel as we go. But before we start installing the batten strip, we want to make sure that we've gotten as much of the creases out and the curtain is hanging as straight as possible. So we're going to start installing the batten strip. We're holding the plastic up like this, and then the batten strip goes over the pipe, and we're using self-tapping screws to go through each hole into the roll bar. Now we don't want the batten strip to come all the way out to the edge of the roll bar like this. We want the batten strip back in line with the edge of the tunnel. And then we'll put a single self-tapping screw through each hole. On our initial pass down the tunnel, we'll skip every 2 or 3 holes and just put one on either end and maybe one in the middle of each batten strip. And as we do this, you may want to lift up on the plastic a little bit just to make sure that your roll bar stays nice and straight and isn't sagging in between the eye bolts, and also that you're pulling all of the slack out of the roll-up side. When you get to the joint in the roll bar, you can see here that we've reached that first joint. We need to put a self-tapping screw through the batten strip and into that joint to keep the roll bar from spinning. We'll do that at each joint all the way down the length of the tunnel. So now you'll just proceed down the tunnel. We're skipping every 2 to 3 holes and securing the batten strip as we go. And then we'll come back and fill in the rest of the holes with self-tapping screws. Now we're going to take the plastic finishing cap and hammer it into the end of the roll bar. We're at the far end. The other end of the tunnel is where we're installing our cranks. So you will do this on the opposite end of the tunnel from where you're installing the crank. Next, we're going to trim off the excess plastic on our roll-up sides, and we'll just start at this end and work our way all the way down. Now you'll repeat the last 2 steps on the other side of the tunnel. Next step is installing our anti-billow ropes. I have my roll of rope set up with a piece of rebar through it on the ladder just so it can spool easily. And we're going to take the end of the rope and we're going to run it through the eye bolts all the way down the length of the tunnel. And when we come through the last eye bolt, we're going to come up and we're just going to tie a loop in the end of the rope. Now we have our aluminum rope clips, and we're going to install it in the lower channel on our double channel, about 4 inches in from the end of the tunnel. You have to kind of pop that in. Once it gets in on the top, it rests down on the lower edge of the channel, and we'll take our rope and slide it through the rope clip just like that. Now we're going to come back about 6 feet, and we're going to lift up the rope and install another rope clip right at the joint in the double channel. It's going to be located right between the 2 eye bolts, and we'll start to get this zigzag effect as we go down the tunnel. So we're coming back again right between the eye bolts. We'll put our rope clip right at the joint in the double channel, and you'll repeat that process down the length of your tunnel. And when we get to the front end, we'll put the last rope clip right in the channel again, about 4 inches in from the end of the tunnel. Now we'll use a trucker's hitch to secure the rope to the rope clip here and also tighten it down the length of our tunnel. Now we're going to come down close to the bottom and we'll create a loop and then pull the line back through. That creates your slip knot. If you pull this end of the rope, it just comes out. So we'll do that close to the bottom here. And now we're going to take the end of the rope, loop it through the clip. At this point, we need to cut our rope. Give yourself a little bit extra, and you'll want to use a torch or a lighter to burn the end of the rope so it doesn't fray out too much. Now we're going to take the end of the rope and go through our slip knot loop there, and then this is when we can really start tightening the anti-billow rope. So we'll pull it nice and snug. We don't want it to be too tight, but we don't want it to be loose. So you kind of have to find a fine balance there. And now we're just going to finish off this trucker's hitch by going around the line and then pulling a loop back through, just like that. So if you need to reposition this knot or tighten the rope a little bit more, you just pull this tail and then you can cinch it up a little bit more. Now to keep this from just pulling out real easily, I like to take the tail and just run it back through like that. And then this end of the rope, you'll either trim it off here, but I like to leave some extra. But to keep this from getting tangled up in the roll bar as the sides go up and down, we'll just tie this tail back down to the main line here like that. That completes the process of installing the anti-billow ropes, and you'll do the same process on the other side. Now we're going to install the hand crank. You want to make sure that you get the left hand crank on the left side and the right hand crank on the right side, because there is a difference in the position of the handle here. And we're going to remove this screw, or this bolt rather, from the socket and slide that over the end of the roll bar. Now once that's fully seated on the end of the roll bar, we're going to take a 5/16 drill bit and we're going to drill through the hole in the hand crank socket here and through the roll bar. Once you get through the first side of the tube, you need to pay attention and make sure that you're getting your drill bit nice and straight so that it comes out in the right spot on the other side, right through the middle of the tube. There we go. Now we'll reinstall the bolt through the roll bar, and we'll do the nut on the backside and then tighten this up with a couple pairs of pliers, or you can get a socket to do that as well. Now we're going to install the handle onto the crank. We're going to remove this small 10mm bolt, and then we also need to remove this 10mm in the spindle here. And there's two different mounting positions for the handle. If you mount it in the farthest towards the end here, that's going to give you the most strength if you have a long tunnel. On the short one like this, you have plenty enough torque cranking this up and down by placing it in the middle position, and that's what we're going to do here. So we'll put that bolt through, and then we also need to start screwing this one in. It can be kind of tricky sometimes because there's not quite enough thread engagement here. We may have to get that one started first. Just start getting it threaded in, and then we'll put this second one. Now that we have that all the way through, we will put the nut on and then tighten down both of these bolts. The next step is to install the guide bar for our hand crank. And we're going to do that by sliding the guide bar down through the white rollers in the hand crank. And then we're going to be extending this chain up just like that. The eye bolt is going to be going through the bow, and this chain and guide bar is kind of hanging suspended. Now, one thing to note is you don't want the guide bar to be resting on the ground when this is installed. And so what we're going to be doing is lifting up a little bit on the guide bar. We want to make sure that the guide bar is still through both sets of rollers on the hand crank, but up as far off the ground as possible while still maintaining contact with those rollers. And once we find that position, we're going to hold the eye bolt in a level position like that and identify where we're going to be drilling that hole. We'll set the guide bar out of the way, and then I like to use a punch to set a little divot for where the drill is going to be. This isn't critical, but when you go to drill that, it's easy for the drill to wander, and if you have your end wall on here, you just could likely puncture the plastic. So just a punch set and make a little divot where that drill needs to follow. Now we're going to take a 3/8 drill bit and drill through the bow as straight as possible. Now we're going to reinstall the guide bar through the hand crank, and then we're going to put our eye bolt through the hole that we've drilled here. We're going to now take the lock washer and nut and install it on the inside of the tunnel. We want to make sure that the guide bar is plumb with the bow, so you can adjust the position of the eye bolt a little bit in or out depending on where you need to be. Now, in most scenarios, you're already going to have an end wall here, so you may need to, be going around that end wall and looking from the outside and then coming back in to tighten it, or get somebody to help you from the outside. But once you get the guide bar in a nice vertical straight alignment there, we're going to go ahead and tighten up the nut on the inside of the tunnel, securing the guide bar. Now you'll repeat the last 2 steps on the other side of the tunnel. The last step is to install the provided rubber caps over the bolts on your wind bracing, tube straps, and on your splice plates. This is just to prevent you from cutting yourself or nicking yourself if you rub up against these. So we're gonna just push the rubber cap over the threads and just kind of twist it on. That completes the installation of the Haven High Tunnel. We hope you enjoy this product, and if you have any questions, reach out to our customer service team. Until next time, happy growing.